Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm Neil Romanowski. I'm the Dean of the Libraries, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here to what is our third installment for the academic year, first in 2020, of our Author at Alden series. And today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Brendan Kendhammer, author of Boko Haram, a history of one of the world's deadliest terrorist groups and their decade-long war in northern Nigeria. I'm also pleased to welcome Dr. Steve Howard, who will be interviewing Dr. Kendhammer. And after our program, I would invite you all to stay around for a bit, join us for some light refreshments over there on the side, and some conversation with both our guests here today and with each other. So Dr. Kendhammer is an associate professor of political science and the director of the International Development Studies program at Ohio University. His teaching and research focuses on religious and ethnic politics in West Africa, in particular Nigeria. And in 2016, he published his first book, Muslims Talking Politics, which explores the relationship between politics and the revival of the Islamic religion in northern Nigeria. He's been interviewed by the BBC World Service, published in the Washington Post, and regularly provides an analysis of political and religious affairs in Nigeria for numerous governmental agencies. Dr. Steve Howard, a longtime friend of Dr. Kendhammer, is a professor and the associate director for graduate studies in the School of Media Arts and Studies. He's a sociologist by training and has studied and worked throughout the African continent. He has published several scholarly articles about the Republican Brotherhood movement. We're delighted to have Drs. Kendhammer and Howard with us today. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you very much. I guess I'm the interviewer, so I will start out. And I'm really happy to talk to Brandon Kendhammer about his book, Boko Haram, today. And I enjoyed reading it very much. And why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your co-author, too?
Yeah, I should absolutely make sure to acknowledge my wonderful co-author, Carmen McCain, who is a specialist on Nigerian literature and film who works at Westmont College in California in Santa Barbara. She and I took Hausa classes together in 2003 at the University of Wisconsin. Her Hausa is much better than mine. It's a little bit of a point of contention, but she works harder at it than I do. And she was, from the beginning of this project, absolutely the person I wanted to work with on this. And so all of the really interesting and good parts, that was her.
Well, in fact, I remember her from, we used to have a summer intensive African language program here, and I remember she came in the early 2000s to study Hausa here in our summer program, so we've actually met. One thing that occurred to me as I was thinking about questions to ask you, we in academic writing, we talk a lot pro and con, something a subtitle, something after a colon, and of course your book doesn't have one. And if you had to give this book a subtitle, what would it be?
Oh, we had a conversation. I don't see Rick Heward here, but Rick and I went back and forth a little bit about the viability of a colon. The series doesn't do that, we were told ultimately.
Oh, I see.
Okay. We thought a little bit about
Okay,
Boko
well,
Haram.
let the series aside, what subtitle would you give?
You know, we had talked about something goofy like a short history, right? But I think the actual answer is why political violence is more complicated than you think it is, right? Or, you know, Boko Haram, what it means to misunderstand an insurgency or a terrorist group.
Okay.
Because we very much proceeded from the idea that this was a group about which, by the time we got around to writing, a fair bit was known, but that a lot of it was sort of misleading or incomplete or inconsistent. And unlike a lot of other bad things that happen around the world, there had been real American attention to this. A lot of people knew about it when we sat down to start writing about it, and we really saw it as an opportunity to clear the brush and come up with an explanation and an answer to some of the questions that we'd been hearing from our students, that I'd been hearing in the media. One time I gave 7 consecutive interviews in a morning to different Canadian Broadcasting Company affiliates, all of whom asked me the same set of questions. And I thought, yeah, it'd be easier if I could just answer this in one shot. And so that's very much what we set out to try to do.
I like this series very much, and I think Ohio University Press is doing a wonderful job with it. But talk to me about the constraint of doing what is in effect kind of a short, literally it's called a short history. What was that a problem, or did that fit your plan perfectly, or talk about that a little bit?
Like a lot of academic writers, the first thing that I really wrote of any great length was this great big book stop of a dissertation, and everybody writes a great big book stop of a dissertation. And I, unlike a lot of people, persuaded a publisher to publish that great big book stop of a dissertation. And so my first book was 110,000 words, 300 and some pages, and you don't have to make a lot of choices of a certain sort when you're writing a book of that length. You can include everything. You can track down the little details. And what I remember about writing that book often are the little stories that I was able to include, these little digressions that are a paragraph long or 2 paragraphs long that tell this kind of rich story when you add them all up. And when you're writing for something like this, you don't have the opportunity to include that same sort of material. And so on one hand, it's an opportunity to be very intentional. Everything that got included ultimately we felt was really core and essential to the story that we wanted to tell. And, on the other hand, as constraining as that can be, and as it's frankly a more difficult kind of writing in terms of prose composition than academic writing, which justly has this reputation of being a little bloated and not very parsimonious. It meant that we did have to make a lot of really difficult choices, and that there are things that I think are important that we don't get into a lot of great detail on, and partly because there are other wonderful books about Boko Haram by my really smart colleagues and other articles that cover a lot of that material. I'm not an Arabist, I'm not a scholar of Islamic theology, and so I left that work to other people. But there's something really powerful about writing for an audience that you think is larger than the 400 specialists in your world, which is very much what my first book was about. We sold more copies of this book in the first 6 months than my first book sold probably in its entire run. And
great.
No, that doesn't mean much in terms of financial stuff for me, but it's a wonderful opportunity in terms of being able to imagine that people who aren't experts in this are getting a chance to look at it, that your audience is not just the people who already care about this and are going to want to quibble about the details. I love those people. I'm one of those kind of people too. But the power of being able to be the first kind of real engaged take that somebody has had about this. They've heard about it in the news, or they just got assigned to that desk at the State Department. Well, how do I get up? What do I need to know? We wrote that for them, and I think that was a real neat opportunity. I'm really glad that this series is around for people like that.
Good. One place I'd like to start is we both teach Africa here at Ohio University, and I always try to, at some point, include talking about Nigeria and whatever course I'm doing that relates to Africa, and because it's the biggest in terms of population, and maybe in some ways there's more drama there than most places too. And so talk to us a little bit about Nigeria.
Yeah. I mean, so Nigeria is undoubtedly and obviously the most interesting place in the world. This is an uncontested fact.
See.
There's a lot of stuff going on in Nigeria. And as you said, it has like a cultural power in the African context that is in a lot of ways very similar to the cultural power that the United States has globally. I see a couple of my students from last semester here in the Intro to International Studies class, and we talked about this a little bit, how Nigerian film, Nigerian media has started to dominate the African continent, right? It's on the satellite networks. It has this kind of gravity to it. It sort of sucks up a lot of attention, and that, on one hand, as an academic, never having to explain why the topic you study is important is fantastic, right? Nobody ever says, why are you studying this thing that nobody cares about and is really obscure? Because this is not it. On the other hand, it's really hard, even as somebody who does this for your whole life, to have a full grasp on everything about Nigeria. I was fortunate, like you, to be trained in an area studies program where we did literature, we did history, we did sociology, and so I like to think that I can keep up. But it's such a big place with so much cultural complexity. It's like being a Nigerian coming to the United States and spending a couple of years and thinking, man, I got to hold on this. There's always something surprising. There is always some nuance or detail that I have to track down or figure out. And in a lot of ways, writing a popular book is a cool experience or cool exercise because it forces you to sort of narrow all of that down and say, okay, this is really what's important. This is what somebody genuinely needs to know about this to be an informed observer.
And that's an interesting point because, too, Nigeria is such a productive country in terms of popular culture too. It's into everything that that entertains people and not.
Yeah. When it entertains people in ways that are positive, right? It entertains people in terms of Nigerians getting nominated for Grammy Awards and Nigerian music having really, in the time since I started working on this, having taken off tremendously in the United States and in Europe. Right? People know Nigerian artists today in a way that was not true 10 years ago. They know Nigerian films.
Nigerian actors.
Oh my gosh,
Right,
I mean,
yeah.
the idea that I can sit down at night and watch a Nollywood movie on Netflix or Amazon Prime is this really incredible development in terms of the sharing of the richness of this culture with everybody else. On the other hand, right, Nigeria justly has this reputation as a place where a lot of things don't work very well, as a place where there is a lot of political and economic dysfunction. And part of that is this legacy of a time in the 1990s when I know you were active in this already and I was sort of just starting to become active. Where
Brandon likes to make it obvious that I'm much older than him. One of his favorite tropes, but go ahead. Yeah.
During the Abacha regime in the 90s when, flights to Lagos were briefly canceled to the United States, and you had congressional delegations who were going to sort of chide the regime for the killing of Ken Saro-Wiwa, about which there was another tremendous book in the Ohio University Short History series. But those two things are true at the same time. It is true that Nigeria is one of the most productive and interesting and dynamic places in the world in terms of the production of culture, that it's a wealthy country that has incredible resources, and also that there is much that is dysfunctional about it. Now that's sort of banal because that's true of a lot of different places, but in Nigeria, the striking division between those two experiences, we talk about this in the context of the book, between being a place where Jay-Z and Beyonce tour and being a place that is actively growing the number of poor people that it has, right? It's the only large country in the world that on World Bank statistics has actually had a real increase in the number of people who are living in extreme poverty. This dynamic shapes everything about Nigeria. And it's a dynamic that even if you're writing about some small pocket of the Nigerian experience, and as much as this is a really big thing in Nigeria, it is a small pocket of the Nigerian experience. Writing about Boko Haram doesn't capture everything that's useful to know about Nigeria, everything that's important about it. That underlying division between the Nigeria of like this great global dynamism and the Nigeria that is really struggling is at the root of almost everything I think there is interesting to say about it. And so we spent a lot of time focusing on that dynamic.
Yeah, as I said, I did enjoy it and I learned a lot from reading it, and there is even a bit of humor in here, and I was amused by the, when you were talking about the very clever Nigerian approach to kids with the requirement that people have motorcycle helmets. Instead, we're carving out calabashes and using those as protective devices instead of just buying a helmet for whatever reason. I thought that.
And again, it gets at this incredible tension because on one hand here you have this wonderfully creative response to a state government mandate that can't possibly be implemented, right? It's this sort of middle finger to the idea that the police are going to come around and harass poor people for the popular mode of transportation. But those of you who follow Nigerian politics, I don't know if there's anybody out there, Lagos, which is the largest state and city in Nigeria, just banned motorcycle taxis 3 days ago. Without any planning, without any idea of how the millions of people who get around on the only real affordable and effective means of transportation in one of the biggest cities of the world are going to now continue to get to work every day. And so this contrast between sort of here's this really creative response and here's the like problem that people are desperately needing to solve because things aren't functioning very well. This tension, this dynamism is a really important part of the Nigerian story.
Well, let's talk about the book and its and the story you're trying to tell by maybe through the lens of maybe some of the topics that have caught the attention of people in the West, and particularly in the United States, and start with the obvious one on that is the Chibok girls.
Yeah.
What was behind that? Who are the Chibok girls, and how does that relate to the Boko Haram situation?
Well, yeah, so let me sort of start with a personal anecdote. I don't think that you know this, but the first time I pitched this book to Jill Berkowitz, who's the former editor of the Ohio University Press, was at a party at your house, one of these African studies get-togethers, and we had sort of gone off into a corner to chat about what biographies they should be including in the series. And I said, I have this idea to write a short book about Boko Haram. It's in the news and people know about it. Oh, that's interesting. That seems like mostly we have biographies, but that seems like it might be interesting. And I said, the hook for me is, what do you tell people about a big, important issue when the only thing they really know about it is this one thing, right? In 2014, 2015, when we were getting started on this, when we were pitching it, this was in the news in America in a way that not a lot of other issues from the African continent are, right? It was covered constantly. It was in social media in this really emerging way, right? The hashtag Bring Back Our Girls, which was originated with Nigerians, but really took off and had this kind of global reach and impact, was something that people who I talked to in my life who know nothing about Africa were well aware of this happening, and there were a lot of celebrities who were involved in this. It generated a lot of media attention, and
Mrs. Obama.
Mrs. Obama, Brad Pitt, and George Clooney are holding up signs at the Academy Awards saying "Bring Back Our Girls," and I said, how do you explain something to people where they know this one thing about it, and they know it really well, and they think that they understand how it relates to everything that's going on, but what do you do when that one thing is kind of misleading? Right? And so this is the angle that we took. At the time, a lot of the international discussion around the kidnapping of these slightly fewer than 300 young women from a school in a rural part of northeastern Nigeria. So you see up there at the top, Borno State, the far right hand, city called Maiduguri. If you sort of draw a line straight south, sort of halfway in between Adamawa and Borno, you can find this little town called Chibok. It's not a little town. I think it's at one point it was like 60,000 people. But relative to a lot of places, it's pretty small in Nigeria. And it's really out of the way. It's not a place that gets a lot of attention in the context of Nigeria. Not a lot of people in Nigeria have ever heard of this. But people understood this kidnapping in the US, and some people in Nigeria too, to have been about sort of women's access to education. This was the rallying point that a lot of people understood about it. That here is this group that is, sort of organized around the idea that education is bad, education is sinful, and they're kidnapping these girls specifically to prevent women from having education. Now, I don't want to downplay that. That is a real sort of part of who they are as a group. But they showed up at that high school compound looking for building materials. They were looking to steal a machine that made bricks, as far as we can tell.
You mean the Boko Haram?
Yeah, the Boko Haram. And the kidnapping was kind of this accidental thing that happened. They hadn't necessarily gone planning to do it. They hadn't known that the girls were there, it seems like, at the time. And so this sort of story that we could understand this group as a part of a bigger global story about women's denial of access to education, it's not that it's wrong, it just doesn't really tell us very much about where this group came from, about what they were doing, about why they showed up in this community, and about how what amounts to 5,000 or 6,000 guys in rural Nigeria had been able to create a crisis that was so big that 10 million people were affected by it. And so we said, we really want to make sure that people understand that that little bit that they know is not wrong. It's not that it's unimportant. It's clearly important. We talk about it a lot. But that there's a lot more to this story, and that if you want to see how this connects to other things that are happening in the region, how it affects the US and European presence in Africa, and how it relates to the global spread of terrorism in the 90s and 2000s, we need to pull back a little bit. And so that was a story that we were really glad to try to be able to tell.
Well, so why do you think that particular storyline so captured the West's imagination then?
So I think the simple answer to it is that unlike a lot of the global issues that temporarily capture people's interest, right? Because as we know, a lot of global issues that emerge out of the global south, people in the West pay attention to them for 5 minutes, right? Or for a couple of weeks, and then it sort of rolls off. But the ask here was very easy. Bring back our girls. We have a specific thing we want to see happen. Maybe we have a little bit of leverage with the Nigerian government or to get the US or the British or the French involved, and we want this outcome. Well, this outcome is incredibly complicated, right? This isn't actually something that anybody could really sort of deliver on in a simple and easy way, but the ask was simple. The unravel years and years of corruption and misgovernance that led to the emergence of a Salafi jihadi group in northeastern Nigeria, the violence that the state perpetrated that helped to sort of organize them into a violent movement, the mismanagement of military resources that allowed them to thrive, the inability of the Nigerian government to maintain control and provide security in rural areas, and frankly, the connections of this to this broader story about global jihad don't boil down to a simple hashtag or a punchline. And so understanding the story in that simple way was a hook that people could hang on to. And there was this sort of tally, right? We could keep track of what was going on. We could see, how much progress is being made. Have they admitted that the girls were actually kidnapped today? Has there been any word about where they are? It was simple. And the longer it went on, frankly, the less people were interested in it, even as the situation in a lot of ways worsened for the people who didn't have access to Twitter, who weren't on social media, but are living in these rural communities in Borno State.
So did the social media aspect of it, the world's interest, how did that impact any kind of containment of Boko Haram?
Not really at all very
Okay.
much. And that, as somebody who teaches international affairs to undergraduates, I sort of struggle with this because on one hand, my entire career is this pitch that this stuff is important and you should pay attention to it, that you should be informed about what's happening in the global arena, that it's possible by being informed and pursuing it that you can make a difference. And the fact that most of the simple and easy ways to be engaged and involved don't add up to very much, that they don't really actually have a lot of power in the world. It is not clear that the organization of kind of an international hashtag sort of activism thing really did very much. And at the time, or it was actually a few years earlier, I think, in the midst of the Coney 2012 business, there's a Nigerian-American writer named Teju Cole who wrote this article in the Atlantic Monthly about the white savior industrial complex, he called it. This idea that Americans struggle to grasp any international event, that they can't turn into a meta-commentary about their level of engagement and sort of participation in the global sphere. And so I recall, I think I mentioned these interviews that I was giving. I did a lot of media in the sort of 6 months after the Chibok girls were kidnapped because not a lot of people had in the US expertise on northern Nigeria. And at one point I was fielding interviews, questions, and answering calls from TV and radio where the questions I was being asked were not what's going on the ground in northeastern Nigeria, what's the Nigerian government doing, what are the motivations of these people? It was, why don't Americans care more? I mean, I gave like 7 interviews in a week and everybody was asking me, why don't Americans care more? I'm like, well, you're all asking me these questions. Somebody is interested in it. The problem is you want this interest to have this automatic and natural outcome of fixing the problem. And as much as I like the idea of teaching people to pay attention and have the skills to parse these complicated issues, knowing that this problem is happening is not the same as having a solution for it. And this sort of powerlessness, this idea that we can't just sort of fix global problems by this episodic and temporary involvement is something that people are uncomfortable with. They don't like that.
Well, in that you put it that way, how much did Nigerians care about the Chibok girls?
And so here, and we talk about this at some length in the book, the domestic politics of the struggle were much more influential, and they mattered a lot more. And in as much as there's kind of a positive story to be told here, it really is that ordinary Nigerian activists, and some elite Nigerian activists, played a really big role in demanding accountability about what had happened, about forcing the government to be more honest about what was going on. And, because the problem persists, because the violence is still ongoing and is in some ways even worse now than it was a few years ago, it's hard to talk about successes, but they extracted a certain amount of real kind of attention and action from the Nigerian government that it was quite originally, initially unwilling to give. One of the stories that we talk about is that the kidnapping occurs at a time when the election campaign is ramping up in Nigeria. And the president of Nigeria, Goodluck Jonathan at the time, was around a group of people, had as advisors, people who very much saw criticism of him from the northern Muslim majority part of the country as an implicit rebuke of his rule. He's from the south part of Nigeria, so down in the Niger Delta region. And there was this kind of mounting conspiracy in a lot of intellectual circles in Nigeria that in essence, this was all not really as bad as people in the north were making it out to be, that this was just a way to make the Nigerian government that was trying so hard around economic development to make it look bad. It happened shortly after, or the kidnapping happened just before the World Economic Forum, the one that happens in Davos, was having sort of a regional conference in Nigeria. And there was a lot of hand-wringing on the part of the ministers in the Jonathan government that, this is taking away attention from all the great stuff that we're doing here. We're trying so hard. Why is everybody telling this story about this problem and this violence? We want to put a focus on the Nigerian economy and how great we're doing. And they really just saw this as a thing that they didn't want to have to deal with. And that ordinary activism, these brave people showing up at Abuja every day and protesting, really did get some movement.
I see. What, you mentioned that it was 300 girls approximately that were kidnapped. This is 6 years later or so. How many of them were ever returned?
So I'm not going to be able to give you the exact numbers. I should have checked in advance, but something in the vicinity of 2/3 have returned home.
I see.
Part of it involved what we now think was a ransom payment on the part of the Nigerian government that brought back a big chunk of them in a couple of different iterations, right? So there was a smaller one and then a bigger return. There were also a number of girls who escaped from the initial kidnapping or who were able to kind of flee over the course of their imprisonment. And the story of what's happened to them is a really interesting one, and it's something that, in particular, Carmen spent a lot of time writing and thinking about in this book, because they have never really been reintegrated into Nigerian society. Partially because they went through this incredibly traumatic experience, and so not wrongly there has been a real effort on the part of the people who are now responsible for them in the Nigerian government to shield them, right, to protect them. But there's also the sense that, I mean, if we're being entirely honest, it was a little bit embarrassing for the Nigerian government, that it didn't know quite what to do. Were they in danger, at risk if they got sent home? Would they be maybe kidnapped or targeted again? What would happen with their families? And so they have remained kind of sheltered away by the Nigerian government. There's a special program at the American University of Nigeria to give some of them a college education, but they've never really had an opportunity to tell their own story in a way that wasn't mediated by the Nigerian powers that be. And a number of them who ended up in the United States ended up kind of being pawns in some respects of this kind of evangelical American Nigerian church movement that really wanted to frame what was happening in Nigeria as a Christian versus Muslim conflict, that it was a civilizational, Huntingtonian clash of civilization story about how Muslims were dominating Christians in Nigeria, in a way that ignores the fact that the vast majority of the victims of Boko Haram have been Muslims, living in rural communities alongside the Christians who live in the community in Chibok, right? In this really simplistic way that just flattens out all of the real meat of the conflict and who it impacts. And so these girls have really not had the opportunity to come forward and describe what happened to them, to talk about what it means, and to be part of the conversation in Nigeria about what should be done, about security, about restorative justice. Their voices are not heard on issues like what do we do with people who have left Boko Haram or who have been captured and gone through de-radicalization. These are people that I would want to hear from if I was in a community thinking about resettling former violent extremists, right? But they're just not part of that conversation.
So to the next main theme of Western interest or concern about Boko Haram, so they're kidnapped from a school, and so what's the deal with education and these what is it about education that the Boko Haram militants are? What's their commentary about that? What's their concern?
So there's been a lot of confusion around this too, at least in part because of a debate about what the phrase Boko Haram means. So Boko Haram is sort of a half Hausa, half Arabic colloquial term, which, by the way, was never a term that the group itself used, right? It was sort of a name that was given to them by their local opponents, like, look at those Boko Haram guys over there who misunderstand Islam.
Well, what was their official name?
I'm going to forget the Arabic. It's like the group for Salafism and Jihad.
Okay.
But not off the top of my head. I can find it in the book for you. Brief pause while I look it up. So what I'll tell you is that, so Boko in Hausa has a couple of different connotations. It has the connotation of kind of deception or hiddenness. It also means book. And so in particular, the Roman script in which Hausa language is written is called Boko, as distinct, for those of you who know a little bit about West African literature, Ajami, which is the Arabic script version of a lot of local languages in West Africa. And so Boko means kind of westernization, right? Like stuff from the West and stuff that is trickery or kind of hidden or obscured. And because of that association with the language, right, that you would go to Boko school to learn kind of English language subjects, it was sometimes translated as Western education. I've always preferred the Westernization translation. And initially, as we were learning more about what this group's ideology was, it was sort of trickling out of Nigeria in the early 2010s. There was a lot of focus, particularly on the name and sort of the preaching of Muhammad Yusuf, the original leader of the group, around issues of participation in Western education, around participation in Nigerian state government stuff. And what we now know, and my colleague Alex Thurston at Cincinnati has done a really good job of kind of clearing the ground on this, they were a pretty conventional extremist Salafi group. Their version of Islam was very much in line with the sort of thing that you might learn from the kind of most extreme version of an education at the Islamic University of Medina, that it was plugged into these global conversations about how do we practice the salaf, right, the real sort of expression of the life of the Prophet, and to obey the religion as it was practiced in the desert in the 7th century. And that was very much, part of this they were part of this global movement. And so it really wasn't so much that just education was bad, or that Western education it was bad. It was that departure from Islam as it was practiced at the time of the Prophet was bad. And their kind of version of that, unlike a lot of other Salafis in Nigeria, was that we extend this all the way to any kind of participation in Nigerian public life. That we really think that we have an obligation to not be a part of it at all.
So, and that's interesting commentary on how prominent the school is in Africa too.
Yeah.
I mean, in Nigeria and Africa, that's becomes the very important, ubiquitous symbol of what's going on in a community, and they're everywhere.
Yeah, and so and we talk about this a little bit too, because there's been a tremendous amount of research in the last 10 years or so about this. Historically, I don't like to use the word traditionally, because what do we mean by tradition after all? But historically, most young men, in particular in northern Nigeria, were educated through this system of Almarajiranchi, these kind of kids who attach themselves to a Quranic school teacher, sometimes in the rural areas, but often in the cities. And they learn kind of a curriculum of Quranic memorization, hadith, and a little bit of tafsir, kind of interpretation stuff. But it's kind of the baseline knowledge that you get as an educated young person. You might not learn to speak Arabic, but you would learn to read it for the purposes and be able to recite the Quran. And at a certain point, really until kind of 50 or 60 years ago, this was, for all of its flaws, a very prestigious kind of education in northern Nigeria. It was the kind of training you got to become a malam, to become a local religious authority who would help people resolve conflicts in the community, who would be a moral leader. And this was, even though the kids were poor and they would often engage in begging as a way to make ends meet during this training, they had a certain amount of social cachet. And in the 60s and 70s, that starts to break down for a whole host of reasons that have been really well explored by other scholars. And by the time the 90s rolled around, these poor, begging kids in the city had become the scapegoat for everything that was wrong in northern Nigeria by Southerners and by wealthy Northerners who saw them as a scourge. And so the initial kind of move on the part of a lot of people who were seeing the emergence of Boko Haram is, well, here is a manifestation of what happens when we have a bad education system. Here is what happens when we leave these kids to run around with these malams who don't really know good Islam, who aren't, taking care of them and aren't responsible, and this is what you get. And of course, the reality is much, much more complicated than that. The public school system in Nigeria is not very good. It turns out that lots of parents and children choose to engage in or participate in this system because it still does have a certain amount of prestige associated with, I'm really trying to lead a life of faith, I'm really trying to engage with my religion, and that relative to the alternatives that are available for poor rural people, this is not always calculated as the worst option. And so there was an effort, I think, along with trying to sort of say, hey, here is a group that is trying to prevent people from getting education, also vilifying a form of education in Nigeria that has often been kind of the scapegoat for every problem that exists, but is really much more complex.
So if they were perceived as trying to prevent people getting this Western education, did they have a concrete program of providing an alternative?
So in the early years of the group, and I talk about the chronology a lot in the book, and I don't need to get into all the little ins and outs, there was sort of an effort to build a community within a community in Maiduguri in the mid-2000s, right? To kind of withdraw from society, set up our own institutions. We'll do everything from kind of microfinance to education. We'll have our own mosques. But this was a big question when this first all started is, well, what do they want precisely? Well, they want to implement Islam as it was practiced in the time of the Prophet. Do they have like an 8-point manifesto and a constitution that they propose? Well, sort of, kind of. They've written some stuff up, but given that they were never going to implement the caliphate, right? Given that they were never going to turn Nigeria into an Islamic state, there was always this tension between the grandiose kind of thematic discourse that they were putting forward and the realities of the fact that they had some supporters but were not themselves a really big movement. And so in terms of, they were not the Muslim Brotherhood is what I'm trying to say. They weren't running these clearly programmatic alternatives that stood up against the Nigerian state and said, look, we can do the same stuff but better and more Islamically.
Okay. So to move on to another key part of the book, you've thrown around a lot of vocabulary this afternoon, tafsir and jihad and Salafi and Malam and so forth. So what's going on Islam-wise with Boko Haram?
So, and here again, I have to devolve into personal anecdote because I think
Sure.
that this is a helpful way to understand how I got here. So when I went to Nigeria in 2007 for my dissertation research, I was there to study the kind of lived practices of ordinary working class Muslims with respect to democracy. I was there to talk to regular folks and figure out how they kind of saw the relationship between their faith and their politics, in the kind of way that we might explore that same question in, say, an evangelical community in the United States, right? Is every political opinion guided by a very clear vision of what the religion says, or are people kind of muddling along, right? And my conclusion was that in a lot of really interesting ways, people were muddling along. In particular, people supported both the governmental-led implementation of Islamic law that happened in Nigeria, in northern Nigeria, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and they also supported free and fair elections and democracy. And I remember at the time, kind of my limited theoretical framework was, my gosh, these things seem contradictory to me. And then I got to Nigeria and talked to people and realized whatever it was that I thought, people had come up with lots of real-world ways to make sense of that both of these things are ways to tackle the problems that regular Nigerians face. We need the Sharia, we need the fear of God in our elites who steal money and don't govern well, and we need elections because that's another way of holding our elites accountable and making sure that people listen to us, the ordinary people. And so I went home from Nigeria with this very positive story about moderate Islam is kind of a reductionist term, and we don't like to use that. But a version of the faith that was not about violence, that was about finding ways to live in a pluralistic Nigeria, even though sometimes there was this struggle around religion, about finding ways to concretely make people's lives better. And I remember very clearly sitting in my apartment in Madison, writing up this very optimistic, positive story, and this news comes over the wire about this riot in northeastern Nigeria, in Maiduguri. 800 people are dead. Nobody really knows what's going on. And this is the start, kind of the uprising that kicks off Boko Haram. And over the couple of years that sort of go forward, I spend a lot of time answering questions about this and trying to reconcile this positive story of people not being dogmatic. Not uncommitted. They're people of deep faith and commitment to their religion, but people who were pragmatic in the relationship between their faith and the rest of their life. People who were looking for solutions that would move their community along. And this smaller, but now very important and prominent group of people who want to blow everything up. And I mean that in like the holistic way, who want to destroy the society as it exists and rebuild it in a model that they have. This just never really seemed like what I had seen. I like to tell this story. The guy who watched our house when we lived in northern Nigeria, my wife and I, his buddy, the guy who worked across the street in the brick-making factory, wore the same Osama bin Laden t-shirt every day for the entire year that we lived in Sokoto. So I don't know, we never quite found out what his religious affiliation was. His buddy, the guy who watched our house, was a Salafi who went to Salafi meetings and would show us kind of extremist Islamist tracks. But the Osama bin Laden t-shirt guy, he liked us, he would wave to us every day, we would say hi, and when the election riots happened in Sokoto, he stood in front of our house and watched it. He's like, we're not gonna let anything bad happen to you guys. I don't know what ideology that is, I don't know quite how to sort of make sense of all of that, but this was not a thing that he seemed deeply troubled by, that inconsistency, or that perceived inconsistency. And now here we have a small group of people who are trying to sort of burn that all down. And I really struggled to make sense of that. And I think that the answer is that the level of dysfunction really had gotten so high governmentally, it really had gotten high so high socially, that a lot of options that hadn't been on the table seemed plausible and believable. And you pair that with a legacy of similar kinds of movements over the course of 200 years in West African history that maybe not all of you are familiar with, but I know you are, right? These jihadi movements, of periodic efforts to revive and revitalize the faith in times of social chaos or when things aren't going so well. You take those two legacies and you smush them together, and now you have a time when plausibly a small group might actually be able to rise up and cause real problems. And I think that this is what happened.
So I think from our Western perspective, we look at Muslims, people practicing Islam, and imagine an enormous amount of homogeneity. But and I have spent a lot of time in northern Nigeria and was very impressed with the religiosity, the spirituality of people in northern Nigeria. They seem to be good Muslims and practicing and so forth. So what was the problem that the Boko Haram group had with the vast majority of Muslims who were not part of their? What was their point to their fellow Muslims?
So the language that's used in the academic literature about this, and it sort of goes along with the Arabic, takfirism, the idea of declaring takfir, is that you're an infidel, that you're not a true Muslim, that you're not a real practitioner of the faith.
And what's the evidence of that?
Well, so let me sort of, the story, right, is that this is a kind of ideology that emerges periodically in lots of different settings, and there are lots of examples of small Muslim groups adopting that position in different places and different times. And the person who really innovates that in Boko Haram's context is the second leader of the group, Abubakar Shekau, who is the villain of the piece, right? He's the real bad guy. He's the one who, after Muhammad Yusuf is killed by the Nigerian government, reorganizes the group, brings it back up, develops its capacity to engage in terrorism and insurgency. And he's the real innovator of this. He takes the basic kind of ideology that he's working with, this Salafism of we reject participation in the Nigerian state, that this is all, you know, the we're Dar al-Islam and this is Dar al-Harb, the sort of pagan world. And he turns that into Muslims who don't believe this same thing are themselves not Muslims. It's a sort of catch-22, right? You can't be a Muslim unless you reject everything that everybody else thinks is being a good Muslim in the context of Nigeria. And so it justifies engaging in violence against ordinary Muslims in public places. The rise of suicide bombing in Nigeria is directly tied to this ideology of it is okay for us to kill Muslims who don't understand that participating in Nigerian public life is haram, is unacceptable religiously to us.
I see.
I've met almost no one who believes this in any meaningful way. Frank, I can't think of a single person that I've met who believes that in Nigeria. But a small number of people who believe that and who can't be contained by the state security apparatus can wreak incredible havoc and cause incredible harm for people. And I think that's what happened.
Okay, so just to go back into trying to understand Nigeria and its the way it's held together as a state. This is also I think the 50th anniversary of the conclusion of the Biafra War, and in fact, I'd say Biafra conjured all kinds of images in the West, like Boko Haram does today, sort of thing, and we're seeing this again. So what was Biafra all about, and does it have any kind of resonance with the situation with Boko Haram?
Oh, what is Biafra all about? There's a difficult question.
Okay.
So Nigeria, there's this quote that I sometimes use in teaching, and I'm not going to remember, I'm going to have to paraphrase it, but it was by a professor of economics at Duke writing in 1960 in a kind of one of those volumes at decolonization. Here's, a profile of every country in Africa, and it was this obscure little book. But he said, Nigeria has everything you could need to be a successful country in 1960. Agriculture is great, lots of mineral resources, industry is going, government is well set up. If Nigeria can't be successful, there's no hope for anybody. 6 years after he writes that, Nigeria is falling apart. We're on our second coup, and we're inching our way towards civil war. And I think that the simplest version of this story is that you had a political system that emerged in Nigeria in the early 1960s that emphasized ethnic division and diversity, right? That played into the differences across different regions along ethnic and religious lines as the kind of core valence of Nigerian politics.
That's how the regions were set up.
Yeah, in the
with-
day there were
yeah.
three of them. There was the
Right.
south, there was the west, the east, and the north. And the north was bigger, both in terms of land mass, but also in population. But the south, in particular the east, was more entrepreneurial. Businesses were doing better. They had more Western education. They were kind of the meritocratic, up-and-coming class of Nigeria, right? And there was this real fear on the part of the northern elite that if we sort of have a fair system in which all the regions have an equal shot at power, we'll get overwhelmed by these communities that had better access to, Christian schools and the missionary schools that had sent more students to train overseas, that they'll take all the government posts and they'll keep all the money. And so the system that was inherited from the British was very unequal. The North had this kind of persistent advantage. And my students, some of them are here, they know that you can't build a political system where you know who the winner is forever and have that be stable. Eventually, that'll break down. And beginning in 1963, 64, 65, that system starts to unravel. There are a series of census efforts where they're going to count people that are rampantly fraudulent because everybody's trying to inflate how many people live in the region so they can get a political leg up. People lose the sense of goodwill and communality, that they're living in a shared country that has a shared vision. And in 1966, you see this massive violent coup organized by these five majors, mostly from the southeastern part of Nigeria, that kill a number of the important leaders from the north and the west. This leads to a counter coup, and things really just sort of begin to unravel. But the Igbo community, the people who live in the east, have this kind of vision of themselves as being able to sort of do better on their own. I mean, and I'm really simplifying this because this is a really complicated thing. But they want to go it alone. The Nigerian state doesn't want to let it fall apart. They secede, are not recognized by most countries around the world, although they get a little support from a few places.
Didn't France?
France briefly recognized them. But the Nigerian military, and again, this is a persistent part of my story, engage in gross human rights violations, massacre people. This is an incredibly violent 3-year war of attrition in which 1 million people die. More than 1 million people either starve to death or suffer from kind of non-battlefield fatalities. It is enormously destructive of the Nigerian and Igbo social fabric. But when the war ends in 1969, 1970, there is an effort to try to bring the country back together. Do I have any Nigerians out in the audience? What was anybody know what the motto was at the end of the Civil Wars? No victor, no vanquished, right? This was the official policy in Nigeria to try to bring things back together. And by one way of looking at it, I've got a colleague who makes this argument every time I see him, things have worked. There hasn't been another Nigerian civil war. We have come up with a set of institutions that is good enough to keep people from fighting in the way that it happened in Biafra. On the other hand, those institutions have not prevented corruption, they haven't prevented misgovernance, and they haven't prevented a real kind of deep-seated disconnect among Nigerians. One of the issues that we emphasize so much in the book is that if this is a conflict where only 5,000 or 6,000 active fighters are causing all of these problems, are engaging in all of this violence, why can't the Nigerian government do something about this? Well, the answer, I think, at the most basic level is a lack of political will associated with the fact that this is a conflict that affects only a small handful of Nigerians relative to everybody else. The vast majority of Nigerians, despite living in a country that has a humanitarian crisis on par with what's happening in Yemen, lead a daily life in which this is not in their face. They don't know anybody affected by it directly. They don't have to deal with it in their daily lives. They have their own problems. And one of the things the argument we make in the book is that Nigeria is constructed almost in the perfect way to prevent kind of poor people who are beaten down by the political system in the Southwest or the Southeast from recognizing solidarity with poor people who suffer from the same problems in the Northeast. They don't see themselves as sharing a common problem that is mediated by the way that the government functions.
Okay.
And this, this is the core commonality, this sort of lack of empathy, of the understanding of how people are all suffering from the way that the system operates, that there are victims in all parts of the country, and that the real perpetrators here, Boko Haram are perpetrators, they're bad guys, I'm not trying to make an equivocation here, but that the way that the Nigerian system governs is not really meeting the needs of its people in all sorts of ways, including resolving this humanitarian crisis. in the same way that it's not resolving the crisis of access to good education and clean water and healthy food in the slums in Lagos. I see these as problems that are deeply interrelated.
Good, that's a good comparison. Before we turn to the audience with commentary or questions, let me ask one more area that resonates with the West, which is child soldiers. What was there any use of child soldiers in the Boko Haram effort?
There is a little bit of evidence. There was a little bit of evidence 3 years ago that the kind of breakaway part that's affiliated with the Islamic State in West Africa province, had begun recruiting young people. And you have to understand when we talk about sort of child soldiers or young people, the image that I think a lot of Westerners have is we're talking about really young kids. So we're talking about 15, 16-year-olds. We got a lot more people who are likely involved in this conflict. But there had been a few kind of pictures that had circulated, seemingly from ISWAP-affiliated kind of social media, showing children. And then a week ago, sometime between a week and a couple of weeks ago, there was another communication from one of the Islamic State groups that seemed to show a captive being executed by what looked in the images like a very young child.
Really?
I mean, I'm not an expert, 9 to 13,
Yeah.
right? And this was kind of the first real evidence that we had had. And so this is an ongoing question. We don't know very much about it. What we do know is that there is this rich political science literature about why groups turn to coercion as a way to recruit people to fight. And it's usually a sign of weakness. It's we can't find enough people to fight by persuasion. And so we are stuck with this. Right? You ramp up the brutality, ironically, as you become more desperate for fighters.
And kids can be controlled.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah, good.
So it's an evolving, we're not entirely sure what's going on yet.
Okay. Well, that's great. Let's open the floor to questions, comments. Anybody have any questions for Professor Kendhammer?
The short answer, which is deeply unsatisfactory and nobody ever seems to like it, is because they were there. I can see that you're not satisfied with that answer. Well,
I mean, to tie into your thing about they were there for Brexit, I think one of the reasons that people were upset about this is supposed to, poverty, corruption, that's in almost all societies since, 3,000 years ago.
right.
But this things like kidnapping young women
Right.
from a different seems a very gratuitous. In other words,
Right.
it's like a serial killer.
Yeah. But
Because you're poor doesn't make you a serial
Well, right.
killer or a kidnapper.
now, yeah, no, I don't want to pick on you, but I'm sure that you remember the 187 boys who were executed several months later in the school 3 communities down, right? Like, that part of the sort of criticism of this was that Boko Haram at the time was engaging in a lot of atrocities. They were not atrocities that were only targeting young women who were pursuing education. They were killing young boys who were pursuing education. They were killing Nigerian soldiers. They were killing farmers. And so in some ways, the arbitrariness of what pops, what gets attention, and what creates a stir in the West was troubling to a lot of people who were sort of dealing with this issue in Nigeria and saying, it's great that you guys are interested in this, but the things that you're talking about are not getting us towards the practical solution to the problem that we have.
Murder is not reversible.
Well, and thinking about what Boko Haram is doing primarily in terms of persecution of young women doesn't really get at the sort of core of the group, what they're doing. It is a part of a much larger, well, no, obviously, yeah. But that's the critique, right? That this sort of frustration that I heard from a lot of Nigerians is, why are people seizing on this one thing? It's terrible, it's horrifying, but people are suffering in all sorts of ways that are just not gaining this attention.
Actually, this may be a related question. So in many cultures, and particularly Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and ones that have been influenced by Islam, but not exclusively. There are cultures in which being kidnapped if you're a woman before you're married is actually considered a fate worse than death because of the whole complex about honor and sexuality and the before there was a legitimate marriage. And I can tell you this has a long history.
Yeah.
Now, this is my question about this part of Nigeria. Are there values like that in which actually it is considered worse for a young female to be kidnapped and essentially taken into a forced marriage, where she will, even if she's returned, she will live with this dishonor if she lives. She might be killed by her relatives. This is a very old set of values that exist in many societies. I will tell you as a historian, it's old in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, and it has been sort of promulgated indirectly through the spread of Islam.
Right. So you see.
That might be one reason why some of these women don't.
Although the women at
With the public, or is it that this part of African culture never accepted those values where they feel that way about?
Yeah, I mean, so part of me, the social scientist in me, to this sort of question about what is the kind of ideology or sort of cultural framework around sort of, I mean, basically everything related to gender and violence is that this is probably a little bit too reductivist to be really sort of coherent around, right? We're talking about dozens of different ethnic communities in northeastern Nigeria, all of which have slightly different traditions and that have, engaged in these issues in slightly different ways. And to talk about sort of like a pan-Kanuri, Islamic purity, gender culture, it's complicated, right? The story that I think is more useful to tell is my colleague Scott McKieran, who at the time was teaching at Bowdoin College, wrote this wonderful book called Searching for Boko Haram. And he had been working in northeastern Nigeria on archaeological digs long before any of this started. And one of the focuses of his research was about the way that these communities in places like Chibok, which was a Christian majority community, not a Muslim community. There are lots of indigenous Christian pockets in northeastern Nigeria that were converted in the 1920s or 1930s, but have been there for a long time, that these communities often have a historical connection to or a legacy with communities that fled slave raiding in the 18th and 19th century. And so Scott's work was about looking at the kind of redoubts, like the places in the hills where people would flee to when the slave raiders would come, mostly part of the Sokoto Caliphate and the kind of Muslim communities at the time that viewed these peripheral areas as kind of reservoirs for people and resources. And so these are communities in which I think the interesting story is less this kind of purity culture, although all of the things that you've said have been true in terms of the way that these girls have been treated. They're absolutely sexually abused. Many of them were put into forced marriages. Many of them now have children. All of those things are true. But the real resonance for a lot of these communities, I think, is the ways in which there are these historical parallels between these communities not being safe places and them not being places where governments or authorities can protect us, going back 150, 200 years, and the very simple parallels between that and what these communities now face. Instead of the local chiefs not being able to defend against the slave raiders, here we have the Nigerian military being unable to show up when they have 8 hours of notice that this group is on the move in this area. That this resonance seems to explain a lot of the way that people in these local communities have talked about this. And it also speaks, I think, to why some people have chosen to participate in or to involve themselves in the group despite sort of the fact that this ideology is not super attractive to a lot of people. It's that I have another colleague who does research on the Nigerian military, and he finds evidence that in some ethnic minority communities there's this intentional strategy where we send one kid to go join the military and we send another kid to join the police and we send a third kid into business because we want to have kind of somebody who can help us in all areas of life. We send one kid into Boko Haram, or we have one person participate because maybe our community will be spared if we're engaged in or we're sort of part of this system. And there's a lot of evidence that people have agreed to participate in violence, not because they are deeply internally invested in the ideology, but because it's a pragmatic way to keep their families safe. They think. Whether or not it actually works is kind of a divided question. But there's not a lot of evidence that, the power of this group is derived from its resonance with deep-seated historical religious traditions in the region, so much as it is this, they are violent, the state can't protect people, people are acting pragmatically, and then there is a little bit of religious resonance.
Other questions?
So I'm taking this class that is a focus on religion and violence, and I was wondering if you have any suggestions on where to
I mean, so it would be, if somebody could write like a short 150-page book that kind of summarizes the basic issues. Oh, he said he's taken a class on religion and violence, and where would you start? Jeff's back there saying, like, you gotta hold up the book now, Brandon. This is what we wrote it for. We wrote it for you. We have a bibliography that'll offer all of the other major sources. I mentioned my friend Alex Thurston, who teaches at Cincinnati. He has a wonderful book that came out in 2017 from Princeton University Press that focuses more on the group's ideology and its religious sort of story, right? In what ways they are and aren't sort of consistent with Salafism, in what ways they construct their arguments and how they relate to kind of domestic trends religiously and international trends. There are a wide range of kind of academic articles that have been written. Again, we've got a pretty good summary. There's an interesting kind of academic debate that happened. I find it interesting. It might not be interesting to regular folks. But about sort of whether or not we understand Boko Haram primarily as a local movement that's driven by local factors, including local religious dynamics, or whether or not we understand them as engineered by kind of international jihadi trends and developments. I'm sort of on team local factors for reasons that I think reflect my training and the fact that I've just been working on Nigeria for a long time, and that's my lens. There are other folks who make the argument that these international factors were more determinate. There is a debate there that you can easily find by putting my name into your search engine of choice. That'd be another interesting starting point. Yeah.
And by the way, the book is for sale over here, too.
So the question was, well, what are the biggest questions? I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, for me, I think for me the biggest questions are the same questions that almost everybody else is asking, which is, what do you do now, right? What does it look like for this violence to end? What does it look like to rebuild and restore these communities? And what does it look like to make them resilient? And this is the language that's often used in the development sphere, right? To prevent this sort of thing from happening again. And unexpectedly to me, because I was not the sort of academic that wanted any interest in working with government or sort of being engaged in kind of practical politics stuff. There's real interest about that from a variety of different governments, both in Nigeria and in the kind of the international sphere. And so I spent a lot of the last 5 or 6 years trying to answer that question in various formats with various different kind of government folks. And I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't think we know yet what it looks like. One of the big unresolved issues is, what do you do with people who have been de-radicalized or gone through a de-radicalization program? Do they go back to communities? Will they be accepted? Should they be accepted? What kind of process do you need to make that happen? How do you differentiate between people who are hardcore ideologues and people who joined out of coercion or out of a sense that it might keep their family safe? How do we think about some of these questions that you raised about kind of the place of women who have been captives or active participants? My colleague Hilary Matfis at Yale has a wonderful book about the ambiguities of what it means to be a woman involved in Boko Haram, right? There are women who have participated in ways that, you know, if we're serious about agency, look like sort of active participation in Boko Haram. And there are women who are clearly just kidnapped, right, who have no sort of say in the matter. There have been women who participated in violence, among other things, because their family members have been killed, right, by the Nigerian government, or who their brothers or cousins were rounded up. And so they've seen participation on the edges of this group as a viable thing. What do you do about that? The peace building and kind of countering violent extremism literature is gendered in all of the wrong ways, right? There are a lot of scholars who are working on this issue to try to improve it, but we still think of women primarily in conflict zones through the lens of victim, and we don't have a kind of agency-driven sort of gender mainstreaming conceptualization of what it looks like to take all of these issues seriously. This is a huge problem. We're working on it. You know, how do you make the Nigerian government take security in rural areas seriously? How do you solve the corruption and the misgovernance problems? These are the things that preoccupy me. And if I knew, I would go tell somebody. This is my joke when I teach this, right? If I knew the answer, I wouldn't be here. I'd be wearing $3,000 suits in Washington testifying before Congress. We're doing the best that we can, but there is a lot of debate about these issues and not a lot of clear answers.
Do we have time for another question? We do, okay. I agree, go ahead.
Yeah, I learned about Boko Haram for the first time when they were kidnapping migrants. But I also understand that they are also operating on the side of Cameroon. So
Yes.
what kind of effect governmental coordination between Cameroon government and the Nigerian government in terms of neutralizing this?
This is a tremendous question. Agri has asked about the international regional dimensions in the Lake Chad basin of this conflict. He mentions he's aware that the group operates in Cameroon. I should point out that they also operate in Chad and Niger and are maybe connected through the Islamic State to groups that operate in the part of Niger where the American soldiers were killed about a year and a half ago, and into Mali. And so there is this interesting regional dimension. The story of that international cooperation and engagement on this issue is one that has been real bumpy, right? Initially, kind of Cameroon was a place, and again, my colleague Scott McKieran writes about this in his wonderful book too, that border has always been porous, right? There are smuggling routes along that border. There are people who make a good living being able to traverse that border. I don't think anybody who's going to ever hear this is going to try to look at my Nigerian visa application. I once crossed that border illegally in 2000 to go have a beer on the Nigerian side from Cameroon in a place that you could not go now safely. That border is a very porous border, like many borders, right? And so initially, kind of the involvement on the Cameroonian side was here are people who are going to Cameroon to flee the Nigerian military, right, to build their efforts, right? And there was some recruitment on the Cameroonian side. There are these islands in Lake Chad on the Chadian side, which are other kind of safe harbors for Boko Haram, but also communities that suffer greatly from that violence. All the governments in that region have had different approaches to dealing with this problem. Initially, a lot of the non-Nigerian governments wanted to sort of just be hands-off, like as long as you're not causing problems here, we don't really need to get into this. We see how destructive this has been to the Nigerian side. But since 2015, when there was a big international, multinational troop surge into the region right before the Nigerian elections, there has been more international cooperation, but it's been rocky. Nigerians don't always get along super well with their colleagues and allies in the region. Military cooperation is often not really strong. There's a multinational joint task force that's headquartered in N'Djamena in Chad that does some coordination. It's not always sort of maximized because, I mean, there are just a lot of interoperability issues, language issues, issues of strategy and political commitment. Cameroon, I'm working on a paper about kind of radicalization and security in Cameroon because I was paid by the US government to do some research about this too. I'm very interested and concerned about the ways in which Muslims in Cameroon, which are a very clear minority, unlike in Nigeria, where it's about 50-50, only about 20% of Cameroonians are Muslims, about how the Muslim Cameroonian community is increasingly viewed as a security threat by the Biya government, in a country that is already doing a lot of really hostile things towards dissidents against the government in the northwest and southwest regions, and how that sort of mounting concern with managing and controlling religious expression is translating all the way maybe into repression of Muslims. So I'm thinking about those issues now.
One of the things that the convenience lens here is to think about Boko Haram in light of the religious aspect of things.
Mm-hmm.
But as somebody who cares about issues of conflict and things like that, I think of them just as another insurgent group.
Yeah.
And insurgencies don't operate in a vacuum. I mean, they need money, preferred weapon, the AK-47, preferred mode of transportation, the Toyota Land Cruiser. And these things cost money to get them. And
Or can be stolen from the Nigerian military. Let's not suggest that you need a cash-only economy to make
yeah,
this happen.
It requires a certain level of entrepreneurship, if you
Yeah.
will, to be able to get some of these things. But beyond, for example, taxing people on those smuggling routes through Chad, into
Of which there has been some, clearly.
right.
Right.
And what else are they doing for money?
Okay, so he's asking what else are they doing for money? What's the sort of economy look like? I have to lead with the sort of funny anecdote, which is that there was a UN report that looked into this that found that the sort of beef jerky trade was a big part of the money that they were making. This Nigerian delicacy called kilishi, which I'm sure you've had, which is this flat kind of strip of meat that they were pulling in.
Suya.
Yeah, well, tens of thousands of dollars on this. There's a kind of illegal fish smuggling trade. They're taxing, trade routes. They're stealing from local communities. But there's this very powerful political science literature that is probably reductionist and probably doesn't capture all of the nuance, but I think was a big radical improvement over the way that we thought about these issues in the 70s and 80s. If you'd have talked to a political scientist in 1980 and said, why do people rebel? Why do insurgencies happen? It's because of grievances. It's because people are upset and they're frustrated. And this literature in the 90s comes around and it looks at these issues much more kind of methodologically clearly. comparatively, right? Really thinking about why do you get it here and not there. And the answer very clearly becomes in the literature exactly what you've said. You need resources. You need opportunity, right? That there are some environments geographically, physically, where it's easy to flee government forces. Mountainous terrain is one of the variables that pops. Deserts in the literature sort of comes up as a variable. But places where there are resources that can be extracted, where there are borders that can be monetized, where there are communities that can be harassed, right? Or money can be extracted, where there are militaries that abandon their vehicles as they're fleeing, from the scene of a battle that they have lost. All of these things also create opportunity, right? That make it feasible. This is the way that the literature talks about this. That insurgency becomes feasible because the resources necessary to make an insurgency happen are more readily available in one place than another. Northeastern Nigeria is a place where insurgency is feasible because of the weakness of state capacity, because of the resources that can be monetized, and frankly, because of the corruption, right? And the way in which resources can be sold off or they can be sort of put onto the black or gray market. And I think that that's a powerful lens. I think it's useful to think of Boko Haram, for all of the importance of the religion and the ideology, as in some ways bound by the same rules that all other insurgencies operate by. I don't know if that gives you comfort or not, but thinking of them as, a normal group in the sense of what they're doing is not invented from whole cloth, right? Gives us some resources and some strategies to think about, right? But that also demonstrates how hard it is to deal with this problem, because making a place not so feasible a place to have violence happen is difficult.
Maybe one more question.
So you've asked about international intervention, and there are sort of two answers to this question. There are not, for the most part, American and European boots on the ground in the Lake Chad Basin. There have been some special operating forces from the U.S., from SOCOM and AFRICOM, right, the Special Operation Command, that have done some training and maybe have done some sort of active activities that I'm aware of kind of in northern Cameroon. And maybe a little bit in Nigeria. But in general, the military intervention from the West has been sort of hands-off. I think for good reasons, because there is real concern about human rights violations, because there's real concerns about the capacity of those militaries to engage with those partners. Now, Chad is interesting because Chad is kind of France's big regional security partner, and so there's been a lot of cooperation on that side, but Chad is not as involved in the day-to-day as Nigeria is for reasons that are sort of obvious in terms of where the group operates. They're pretty involved, but they're not always on the Nigerian side. The international intervention has been primarily humanitarian, right? The need was estimated a couple of years ago at $1 billion annually, and they were raising less than half of that from the international community in terms of humanitarian assistance. It is a full-blown, massive, complex humanitarian crisis that has gotten a little bit better in the last few years, but frankly, the resources aren't there. The groups often target humanitarian aid workers and actors. There's been a spate of recent kidnappings and killings of humanitarian workers on the part of ISWA and Boko Haram, and the Nigerian military is very skeptical of groups like Médecins Sans Frontières that adopt, or the Red Cross, that adopt this sort of official neutrality. Like, we're here to help, right? We're here to get aid into rural communities where they need it, even if that means, having to turn a blind eye towards what Boko Haram is doing. And so the Nigerian government has tried to kick Médecins Sans Frontières out, right? They've sort of politicized the UN presence by saying these people are providing assistance to our enemies, rather than sort of thinking of them through the standard kind of humanitarian lens. This is a very complex issue in Nigeria. People get really ramped up about it. There's also a lot of money that goes in, and this is some of the stuff that I do, issues related to how maybe you design programs to make people more, how to do de-radicalization, or to make them more resilient and less vulnerable in the face of extremist ideologies or the pull factors that suck people into violent extremism. There's a lot of money there. We're uncertain about how well that stuff works. The US government set up a radio station in Kanuri language to broadcast messages of peace that I think is a noble enterprise, but we're not entirely clear how well it works in terms of keeping people from fighting. Most members of Boko Haram are Kanuri speakers in their private kind of moments. We have some videos that suggest this. It's going to be a variety. It's going to depend on who's meeting. A lot of the upper leadership are going to be Arabic or Hausa speakers as well. I mean, Hausa is a lingua franca across the entire region. Kanuri is a language that has a lot of resonance in that specific area, but is not sort of widely spoken by everybody who might trickle into the group. We have some videos that have been sort of examined that were captured by the group, from the group, that suggest that, like, privately when they're messing around, a lot of them speak in Kanuri.
But the meetings might be held in some.
It's hard to know. It would depend on who was
So it's a
present.
secretive group, you can't actually interview
Yeah.
somebody who's a self-proclaimed.
I mean, there have been a few journalists that have had access to people, and that they certainly release a lot of Arabic language stuff now through social media. They've adopted kind of and Carmen talks about this in the book, the sort of facade or kind of symbolism of the Islamic State, which they had done even before the official pledge of affiliation, that they had borrowed some of the kind of rhetorical devices of the Islamic State. Now they use Islamic State branded kind of music and symbols, all of which is obviously in Arabic. Yeah, it's complicated.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Drs. Kendhammer and Howard for a wonderful conversation.
Nice job.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
both.
for asking me the questions.
I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our colleagues at the press for bringing this wonderful work into the world. And as was mentioned earlier, this book and Dr. Howard's book are actually for sale on the table right over here. Please join us to stay around for some snacks over there on the side and some conversation. And I also want to finally thank our colleagues in the library, Jen Harvey, our events coordinator, many students and others who helped make this event possible today, as well as our colleagues in the back on the audiovisual. Please join us again for our next author at Alden event. Thank you.